January 18th, 2026, a date that will mark the moment the world's most powerful alliance discovered that friendship has a price tag, and Washington is sending the invoice. And this is indeed the beginning of much more serious events than just another round of diplomatic theater over frozen real estate. 8 NATO allies. 10% tariffs escalating to 25%. A territorial demand that hasn't been made between Western powers since the annexation of Austria in 1938. But what most analysts miss in the headlines is this: Greenland is the spark. The real fire is the systematic dismantling of the post-war economic order. And Europe just became the first casualty of a strategy that could reshape global power for the next century. Subscribe now if you want to understand the calculations driving history. I'll show you the math that explains why everything you thought you knew about American foreign policy just became obsolete. Here's what you need to understand first. On Saturday, January 18th, President Trump announced that 8 European countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, would face escalating tariffs. 10% starting February 1st, 25% by June 1st, not until they negotiate better trade terms, not until they increase defense spending, until they force Denmark to sell Greenland to the United States. Read that again. The United States is using economic coercion to acquire the territory of a NATO ally, a founding member of the alliance that has defined Western security for 77 years. The tariffs would stack on top of existing rates, which already average about 15% on goods from EU countries and roughly 10% from the UK. We're talking about combined tariff rates potentially reaching 40% on some goods. For context, that's approaching Smoot-Hawley territory, the 1930 Tariff Act that accelerated the Great Depression. But here's the mechanism that matters. This isn't a normal trade dispute. European leaders moved quickly to convene an emergency meeting, condemning the tariff threats as unacceptable and warning of serious consequences for transatlantic relations. The 8 targeted nations issued a joint statement calling the move a threat to the alliance itself. They warned that the tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. Think about what just happened. The United States threatened economic punishment against its closest military allies for conducting a NATO training exercise. Not for trade violations, not for security breaches, for sending troops to defend territory that's already part of their alliance. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas warned that the tariffs play right into the hands of China and Russia, noting that China and Russia must be having a field day. They are the ones who benefit from divisions among allies. Now let me show you what's really happening beneath the surface. Europe isn't defenseless. They have a weapon, and it's massive. European countries own $8 trillion of US bonds and equities, almost twice as much as the rest of the world combined. That's not a typo. $8 trillion. To put that in perspective, China holds roughly $800 billion in US treasuries. Japan holds about $1.1 trillion. Europe holds more American debt than the next 7 countries combined. Here's the strategic calculation as explained by Deutsche Bank's George Saravelos. In an environment where the geoeconomic stability of the Western alliance is being disrupted existentially, it is not clear why Europeans would be as willing to play this part. Translation: if America is going to treat Europe as an adversary, why would Europe continue financing American deficits? The implications are staggering. The United States runs chronic trade deficits and budget deficits. Offsetting the U.S. trade imbalance requires heavy inflows of capital from abroad, and the Treasury Department must finance budget gaps by issuing more debt, often to foreign investors. Europe has been the largest buyer. What happens if they stop? Danish pension funds led the charge last year in reducing dollar exposure and bringing money back home, what analysts call the Sell America trade. Do the math. If European institutions dump even 20% of their U.S. holdings, that's $1.6 trillion flooding back into European markets. Treasury yields spike. The dollar crashes. American borrowing costs explode. Every percent increase in treasury rates adds hundreds of billions to federal interest payments. We're talking about a financial weapon that could trigger the kind of crisis that makes 2008 look like a practice run. But Europe has another tool, something they designed for China, but are now considering using against their supposed closest ally. The Anti-Coercion Instrument, which is the bloc's most powerful trade weapon and has never been used since it was adopted in 2023. French President Macron is reportedly pushing for its activation. What does this thing do? In addition to limiting trade in goods and services, the Anti-Coercion Instrument could also target foreign direct investment and financial markets. The tool covers services, investments, and access to public procurement. It allows for steps such as excluding foreign companies from EU tenders or partially suspending the protection of intellectual property rights. In plain English, Europe could freeze American tech companies out of the world's second largest market. They could block Boeing from bidding on European contracts. They could strip patent protections from American pharmaceuticals. European capitals may hit the US with 93 billion euros worth of tariffs, or restrict American companies from the bloc's market. This is the trade bazooka, never before used, designed to respond to economic coercion. And right now, European diplomats are debating whether the United States of America qualifies as a hostile economic power engaging in coercion. Now, let me connect this to something that barely made headlines but explains everything. Last summer, the United States and European Union signed what they called the Turnberry Agreement, named after Trump's Scottish golf course where it was negotiated. On July 27, 2025, the United States and European Union reached a political agreement, with the framework providing for 15% tariffs on all European exports and 0% tariffs on certain U.S. exports. But here's the part that matters. The deal included massive European commitments: purchase $750 billion in U.S. energy products by 2028, invest $600 billion in American strategic sectors by 2029, eliminate tariffs on U.S. industrial goods. In return, the United States would cap tariffs at 15% instead of the threatened 30%. Sounds reasonable until you run the numbers. Energy analysts calculated that even if Europe bought every available drop of American LNG and oil, they'd reach maybe $207 billion by 2028. The target is $750 billion. That's not an aggressive goal. That's physically impossible. European natural gas demand is declining, down 2% in 2026, projected down 7% by 2030 as they transition to renewables. The United States is demanding that Europe buy energy they don't need, can't use, and that directly contradicts their climate commitments. And here's the kicker. As a result of the Greenland crisis and Trump's threats of a trade war against several EU and NATO members, EU leaders said the approval of the agreement cannot proceed. The European Parliament hasn't ratified the Turnberry deal. And now, with the Greenland tariff announcement, multiple parliamentary groups have declared it dead on arrival. Think about what this means. The Trump administration spent months negotiating a trade framework. European Commission President von der Leyen took massive political heat for agreeing to what critics called submission to American demands. Germany's incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz supported it to avoid worse outcomes. And now Trump has torpedoed his own deal by threatening the same countries he just finished negotiating with. This isn't strategy. This is demolition. The question is whether it's intentional or incompetent. And I'm not sure which answer is more terrifying. Let me show you the game theory at work here. NATO functions on a principle called collective defense. Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. But that only works if members believe the commitment is credible. What game theorists call the shadow of the future. I cooperate with you today because I expect our relationship to continue tomorrow. What the tariff ultimatum did was change the shadow of the future for every NATO ally. Denmark is small, 5 million people. They cannot resist sustained American economic pressure. But every other European capital watched what happened. They observed the United States treating a founding alliance member as a vassal state, demanding territorial tribute in exchange for market access. The rational response? Hedge, diversify, reduce dependency. If America will coerce Denmark over Greenland, what stops them from coercing Germany over trade policy, France over defense cooperation, or Poland over immigration? The answer is nothing, and European capitals know it. European leaders now find themselves confronting perhaps the sharpest challenge yet from the White House, after more than a year of cautious diplomacy, high-stakes flattery, and efforts to keep transatlantic cooperation intact. The episode has raised fresh questions about how much longer Europe is willing to absorb pressure from Washington in the name of a NATO alliance that appears to be bursting at the seams. Here's what this looks like in practical terms. France is accelerating strategic autonomy, the doctrine that Europe must develop independent military capabilities rather than relying on American guarantees. Germany is reconsidering decades of defense restraint. The Nordic Council issued a joint declaration rejecting U.S. overtures, presenting a unified front that didn't exist 3 months ago. European defense spending will increase. Not coordinated with Washington, independent of it, French defense contractors will fill orders that would have gone to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. European intelligence services will share less with American counterparts. Military planning will increasingly assume U.S. unreliability as a baseline. We're not losing an alliance in a dramatic collapse. We're watching it hollow out from within. Trust transaction by trust transaction, decision by decision, until the structure that won the Cold War becomes a shell. While Washington obsesses over Arctic ice, Beijing is watching with undisguised satisfaction. Because the defining metric of 2026 isn't military power or economic size, it's consistency. For decades, the United States accumulated what I call trust capital, the credibility of being a reliable partner. That capital allowed us to build coalitions, set global rules, and project power far beyond our military reach. We are liquidating that capital at an astonishing rate. China's pitch to the global south isn't ideological, it's pragmatic. We don't change our deals every election cycle. We don't threaten tariffs when you disagree with us. We build ports and railways. We show up. America's largest trading partners are actively strengthening trade relations with other nations. Canada celebrated a strategic partnership with China last week, including easing tariffs and selling Chinese EVs. And the EU announced it struck a deal with South America's Mercosur bloc, capping off 25 years of trade negotiations. Think about that timing. While Trump demands territorial concessions from NATO allies, Europe is finalizing a comprehensive trade deal with South America. While the US threatens economic warfare against Germany, Canada is easing restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles. The pattern is clear. American volatility is driving partners toward alternatives. Even Saudi Arabia, historically one of America's closest partners in the Middle East, is hedging. The kingdom has begun settling energy transactions in renminbi, issuing bonds to access Chinese capital markets, explicitly prioritizing Asian capital flows in their investment laws. Why? Because partners who threaten tariffs over political disagreements might weaponize the dollar against you next. Better to diversify. The ultimate irony of the Greenland strategy is this: by obsessing over potential rare earth deposits we don't control, we're losing the actual battle for global influence. While we allocate diplomatic bandwidth to annexing territory, China is locking up supply chains across Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. We're fighting for the map. They're redrawing the trade routes. Now let me show you the balance sheet, because that's what this comes down to. Strategic benefits of controlling Greenland. Potential resource independence from Chinese rare earth processing, though extraction would take decades and cost hundreds of billions. Enhanced missile defense positioning, though we already have operational access through existing agreements with Denmark. Symbolic completion of North American consolidation. Total strategic value. Moderate, long-term, uncertain. Economic costs. Dollar appreciation potentially 10 to 15%, devastating for manufacturing exports. If Greenland resource extraction floods the economy with trillions in natural resources, every American exporter, Boeing, John Deere, Intel, faces a currency headwind they cannot overcome through efficiency gains. The factories that close won't be in Washington or New York. They'll be in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the industrial heartland, the swing states that decide presidential elections. Capital displacement from industrial reshoring to Arctic extraction. Labor market distortions as extraction wages ripple through the economy. Fiscal absorption of Greenland's $600 million annual welfare costs, likely ballooning under U.S. administration. This is Dutch disease. The Netherlands discovered natural gas in 1959, celebrated the windfall, and within a decade watched their manufacturing sector collapse as the currency appreciated and cost structures inflated beyond competitiveness. Total economic cost, high, immediate, certain. Diplomatic costs. At face value, a 10% tariff rising to 25% would have minimal economic consequences, capital economics estimated, reducing GDP in targeted NATO economies by 0.1-0.3 percentage points. The political ramifications would be far greater than the economic ones, analysts warned, with any attempt to seize Greenland potentially leading to irreparable harm to NATO. Collapse of comprehensive trade agreements that took years to negotiate. Erosion of NATO trust architecture built over 77 years. Moral equivalence to Russian actions in Crimea, undermining coalition building against actual adversaries, acceleration of global South pivot toward China as a consistent partner, total diplomatic cost, catastrophic, permanent, irreversible. Here's the conclusion I've reached after examining the data. Acquiring Greenland solves a 20th century security problem. Resource independence, territorial buffer, missile defense. These are Cold War concerns wearing 21st century clothing, but in solving that problem, we create 21st century catastrophes. Industrial decline through currency appreciation, alliance fragmentation through coercive diplomacy, global realignment through demonstrated unreliability. With the U.S. net international investment position at record negative extremes, the mutual interdependence of European-U.S. financial markets has never been higher. according to Deutsche Bank strategist George Saravalos. It is a weaponization of capital rather than trade flows that would by far be the most disruptive to markets. The Greenland strategy isn't that the island is worthless. It's that the method of acquisition triggers cascading failures across every other dimension of American power. We would gain the high ground of the Arctic while surrendering the high ground of economic competitiveness, alliance leadership, and moral authority. The Trojans didn't fall because the horse was empty. They fell because they wanted the gift so badly they stopped calculating the cost. 38 million tons of rare earth oxides, strategic Arctic positioning. The front porch of North American defense, it looks like a prize. The math says it's a trap. What I've learned analyzing geopolitical systems is that the most dangerous moves in international relations aren't the obvious aggressions. They're the gifts that seem too good to refuse. The deals that solve one problem while creating 10 others. The strategies that look brilliant until you run the numbers. January 18th, 2026 marked the day the United States stopped leading an alliance and started demanding rent from it. 8 countries, 77 years of partnership, $8 trillion in leverage, all put at risk for an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. The question isn't whether America can take Greenland. The question is whether America can afford what it costs. Not in dollars, but in everything else that makes a superpower actually super. Trust, reliability, the willingness of others to follow our lead not because they have to, but because they choose to. We're about to find out if you can run an empire on threats alone. History suggests the answer is no, but this administration seems determined to test the hypothesis. Subscribe if you want to understand the calculations behind the headlines. The math doesn't lie even when the politicians do. I'll keep showing you the numbers that explain why everything is about to change.